Welcome to Cracking Cooperstown, where we talk all things Baseball Hall of Fame and Hall of Fame collecting. Join us as we discuss Hall of Fame voting, autographs, cards, baseballs, resumes, and trajectories. Debate and discussion as we look to crack the code to Cooperstown. Now here's your host, Jake Brewer, Dom Manna.
Say it ain't so, Rob. We bring you an emergency episode of Cracking Cooperstown, an unprecedented pod in unprecedented times. As just yesterday, Major League Baseball and Rob Manfred announced that a long-standing rule in place is no longer to be. In response to a petition from the family of Pete Rose, Commissioner Robert D. Manfred Jr. issued a policy decision regarding the status of 17 individuals who passed away while on the permanently ineligible list. Excerpts of the letter to the lawyer for the Rose family included the question of whether an individual should remain on the permanent ineligible list after his death has never been formally addressed by Major League Baseball. Indeed, Mr. Rose is the first person banned by the commissioner other than Kennesaw Mountain Landis to die while still on the ineligible list. As such, it is incumbent upon the office of the commissioner to reach a policy decision regarding this unprecedented issue in the modern era. In my view, once an individual has passed away, the purposes of Rule 21 have been served. Obviously, a person no longer with us cannot represent a threat to the integrity of the game. Moreover, it is hard to conceive a penalty that has more deterrent effect than one that lasts a lifetime with no reprieve. Therefore, I have concluded that permanent ineligibility ends upon the passing of the disciplined individual. Mr. Rose will be removed from the permanently ineligible list. I want to emphasize that this is not part of my authority or responsibility to express any view concerning Mr. Rose's consideration by possible election to the Hall of Fame. I agree with Commissioner Giamatti that the responsibility for that decision lies with the Hall of Fame. I've given Robert Manfred Jr. his flowers on my other show, Solo Shot Sports. I think he's going to be a Hall of Fame commissioner one day. He's done a lot of great things for the game, as much slack as he gets. And I think he's going to be remembered by a lot of people as, the man who saved baseball, the people's manager, changing all these things for the betterment of the game. This move, coming 7 months after the death of all-time hit king Pete Rose, is definitely a pull for the people. It's something a lot of people have been asking for. It's something that comes up in Hall of Fame discourse quite a bit, that the all-time hit king is outside of the Hall of Fame. And my rebuttal to that for many years had been that the Black Sox players over 100 years ago in 1921 had been banned by Kennesaw Mountain Landis for throwing the 1919 World Series, being deemed the Black Sox. They had been banned by Major League Baseball, shoeless Joe Jackson at the time, fourth all time in batting average, banned from baseball. Over 30 years later, he dies in 1951. They do not make this reprieve for him. Through death, he never appears on a Baseball Hall of Fame ballot or on an era committee selection, a private ballot, nothing. And I said, if Black Sox players have been dead for decades and not considered it, it's coming up on 75 years since Shoeless Joe has been deceased. Pete Rose, to me, is not a real Hall of Fame candidate, so I never partook in the Pete Rose Hall of Fame decision. I stood with Major League Baseball because they took a stand that this is the one, hard line in the sand that we do not cross. This is the clear, there is no gray. This is the black line. You do not cross it. The 1919 Black Sox put a stain on the game. It was a huge scandal at the time. And, nobody of big name and stature had challenged it because it was in all the contracts. It was in all the handbooks. It was in all the locker rooms. And Pete Rose was the first big player to challenge it and to get caught. when he was suspended in 1989, it caught like wildfire. It was a huge, huge thing.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a lot of people celebrating today. And I think there is some cause for celebration that these players will be considered by the Hall of Fame. But it does hurt me a little bit that, Major League Baseball had been consistent about something, about the integrity of the game, and nobody's above this law. This was the one clear line in the sand that Major League Baseball had. The Hall of Fame followed suit, did not acknowledge these players. And in Rob Manfred's statement, he even said that a person no longer with us cannot represent a threat to the integrity of the game. But to me, why that ban for betting on the game was so powerful is because nobody was above that law. It didn't matter how big the stars of the 1919 Black Sox were. It didn't matter how big of a star Pete Rose was in 1989. You do not mess with the integrity of the game. You do not bet on it. It is a children's game that we play with competitive spirit and for the right reasons. And I think that is the kind of somber aspect of this is, that rope has now been pulled 7 months after the death of Pete Rose. I know a lot of people out there were saying that this is going to happen. When Pete Rose dies, then they'll put him in. They won't give him his day in the sun to make his speech, but he will get in postpartum. And instead, this happens 7 months later, and we're sitting here. The Hit King's going to be in the Hall of Fame. And that is something that is exciting in a lot of ways. It's something that the Hall of Fame has been missing to an aspect. And it's something that I will celebrate, when that election day comes, when that result comes. But I was not personally, entertaining this thought until something official happened like this. And now I have to pivot. Pete Rose destroys my qualifiers to get into the Hall of Fame. He hits multiple automatics. So, Jake, what are your instant reactions when you heard the news about Robert Manfred's decision?
So for any listener that's, been around Cracking Cooperstown for any amount of time, we have essentially at the beginning of episodes where Pete Rose could have been mentioned or involved, we have essentially been like, we're not going to talk about Rose. It's a non-starter. He's on the ineligible list. Like there's been no point to discuss it. Like most baseball fans, I feel like, especially in today's age, is like Pete Rose should be in. But us as, minor, we consider ourselves minor historians of the Hall, if you will, as a hobby. We're like, it's a non-starter. It doesn't matter. He's on the ineligible list. There's no point in talking about it. Sure, regardless of where he falls on, statistically and what we think, doesn't matter. Not possible. We're not going to waste airtime on it, regardless of how we felt about Rose. Now, with this announcement, I think you were more vocal about it and more adamant about it, but I felt the same as you of like, it's never going to happen. Like they're never going to lift this. They haven't lifted it for Shoeless Joe for forever. Even with all of the new partnerships in MLB with gambling, where we see, all FanDuel and all of these things at every turn, it didn't change. Even though Rose was around the game a little bit more in a couple different stints, and then he would shoot himself in the foot in some way, whether it was on air, on the broadcast, or, when he was at Hall of Fame induction weekend for, the Reds Hall of Fame. It always seemingly followed Rose, some to his own detriment, and some he just couldn't elude it, that those questions would always come. Regardless of your stance on Rose as a person, what he did statistically on the field was never in doubt. So I am, as many of you know, a man of faith. I'm a believer in forgiveness. I'd be quite the hypocrite if I wasn't. I'm excited that he is now off the ban list. At the same time, it's very sad that he didn't have the opportunity to be extended that forgiveness while he was alive. Same goes for Shoeless Joe or any of these other guys. I believe in second chances. I think America is a place of second chances. Even if you want to make the argument, some of them got second, third, fourth chances of these guys we're going to talk about today, other than just Rose and Shoeless Joe. But at the end of the day, I hope that if it does come to fruition, we're going to get into the details in a moment. If it does come to fruition that Rose does wind up being elected to the Hall of Fame, that it tells the full story, that it paints the full picture of, we don't forget, what happened with the Black Sox. We don't forget what happened with Rose's ban and why it happened this way. Because on both sides of the coin, I think in some aspects you're correct about Rob Manfred trying to angle himself as the people's commissioner. I'm the modern commissioner. I'm here for the fan. Everything that he's done, decisions point to trying to paint him in that light, trying to give him that narrative. And, a lot of traditionalist fans hate the guy. Well, this decision, who would it make happy? The traditionalists, the guys that saw Rose play, the ones that have loved the game for a long time, not the modern casual fan. Probably has a less polarizing opinion of Pete Rose, I would be willing to bet. So I am representing Mr. Rose today on Cracking Cooperstown. Dom, I know you mentioned a little bit there about how you think this affects Manfred's legacy, if you will, or maybe the narrative he's trying to create for himself. Because, he's spoken publicly already kind of what his timeline looks like of when he may, finish up his time as commissioner. What do you think he was really trying to say, or what he was really trying to accomplish with this decision? And part 2B of that, why do you think it came about now? Because I think this is a multifaceted thing here.
I think, like you said, it was more of a broad public appeal. He's giving the people what they want. And by, lifting this ban on the Major League Baseball side of things, he is now taking all of the credit and he's taking all the pressure off him, and he's immediately putting the pressure on the Baseball Hall of Fame. Even in that statement, I will not give my opinion about his Hall of Fame election. That belongs with the commissioner and the Hall of Fame museum down there in Cooperstown. So he's done his part, essentially. He will get credit. I would not be surprised if he is, the one giving Pete Rose's induction speech. He's definitely one of the candidates to do so by lifting this ban and continuing that positive narrative of, I'm the commissioner who did this. With the timeline of things, I think as soon as Pete Rose passed away, he started making calls and figuring out how to put this in motion. Because this happened quick in baseball terms. Like we said, Shoeless Joe Jackson has been dead for 74 years. And he's been banned from baseball for 104. Nothing got moved by any of the commissioners from Landis to Manfred. Nothing.
And there had been appeals from the Shoeless Joe Jackson family, just like there has been people advocating, both Rose himself and others, in the same fashion. So it's not like Shoeless Joe's had nobody in his corner. That's been ongoing as well.
No, absolutely. And that's why the appeal of the family, I think, means nothing. I think it's more about the public perception. It's about the glory of being the commissioner to put this into motion. Manfred couldn't have gotten away with this, I think, if Pete Rose was still alive, for many reasons. But as soon as he crossed over into hopefully a better place, that opened up the door for Manfred to make this play, to make this plea to the Hall of Fame, saying the fans want him to at least be considered. I'm not saying you have to elect him, but he's the all-time hit king, and he deserves to be considered. We've had, other potential rule breakers, steroid users, criminal acts, different things beyond the baseball.
Bangers.
Yeah, exactly. So be on the baseball writers ballot, and some of them do well, even get elected. So just give him a chance, put him in the pool of players to be considered. And the Hall of Fame has immediately gotten out in front and made a response. Jake, I know you have that ready to go.
Mm-hmm. I'll make one more comment on Manfred, because I really think that the biggest thing that he wanted to accomplish here is he wanted to go, I'm not the bad guy. Because in so many ways he's been painted as the bad guys by different fan bases. I know he's guys hated in Atlanta for everything that happened with the World Series and for them and all of that. A lot of traditional fans don't like him because of the modern rule changes. Now, we're not going to get into debating all of those and what we think of them, but he is disliked for that reason. A lot of people view him, you've seen the mock-up clown shirts of Manfred because he's disliked. I think he's trying to say, I'm not the bad guy here. I'm the good guy. I'm the people's hero. I hear you. I heard that you guys want Rose, the public outcry. I'm giving the opportunity. I'm not holding him back, right? And even with everything we've already talked about, this entire conversation could stop if the Hall of Fame and its board of directors essentially was like, we don't care. We're not putting him on the ballot. Okay. Because contrary to popular belief, Major League Baseball and the Hall of Fame are two separate entities. Now, are they in bed together? Are they reliant upon each other in many different ways to exist and coexist? Of course. But technically, Rob Manfred doesn't get a vote. He's not on the board of directors for the Hall of Fame. It's controlled by a separate group, in theory, a separate group of people. Okay. So the statement that immediately came out from the Hall of Fame is important. And I'm going to read it here. This is from the chairman of the board, Jane Forbes Clark. It states, the National Baseball Hall of Fame has always maintained that anyone removed from baseball's permanently ineligible list will become eligible for Hall of Fame consideration. Major League Baseball's decision to remove deceased individuals from the permanently ineligible list will allow for the Hall of Fame candidacy of such individuals to now be considered. The Historical Overview Committee will develop the ballot of 8 names for the Classic Baseball Era Committee, which evaluates candidates who made their greatest impact on the game prior to 1980 to vote on when it meets next in December 2027. So, ergo, the Hall of Fame basically says, we're following suit with MLB. Now it is possible for them to be placed on the ballot. And I don't know about you, Dom, but I don't think that the Hall of Fame wants anything to do with a PR where they say, well, they're eligible to be put on the ballot, and they don't do it. I would be absolutely shocked if we don't see at least one of the 2 big names that we're going to talk about, a handful of them, appear on that ballot when the Classic Era Committee meets again.
No, I agree. James Forbes Clark and the people over there at the Hall of Fame, which is actually a nonprofit. A lot of people don't know that. It's a nonprofit museum. They run a good ship over there, and they handled this about as good as they can. I'm not saying that they were blindsided by this with how quick the response came out. They were clearly counseled by Rob Manfred in Major League Baseball. Hey, we're calling around
this
to
is
put
coming.
this in motion. This is coming. Prepare a response. Hide your kids, hide your wife, whatever you got to do. Be ready for the Pete Rose, Shoeless Joe Jackson outcry, because it's a very loud group in our space of baseball fans and hobbyists. The thing that's great about this for the Hall of Fame side of things is we just had the Classic Era ballot. So it's not like this upcoming December they're eligible to be on it. We have to kick other living candidates or deserving candidates off. They have a couple years to really iron this out, decide who's going to be on this committee, who else is going to be on the ballot with these players, how do we handle it, do we space them out? The thing that is really interesting when you start thinking about the electoral aspect of it with the way the Hall of Fame era committees are now currently set up is it's happening every 3 years, which is more quickly than it was in years past. Mm-hmm. But they've added a new kind of aspect that going forward, if the player it appears on an era committee ballot and does not perform well, doesn't get necessary amount of votes, usually that group of players that is like, they listed on this year, Tommy John, Dave Parker, and Dick Allen, and didn't put out the vote totals to anyone else because they got 4 or less real support, not being on the next time this ballot comes around because they didn't get that support. And that's kind of pushing the people that are on these committees to use all 3 votes to be a little more intentional with how they vote, and trying to hopefully force more collusion to have some bigger classes, I think, as well, because everyone voted for Parker and Allen. A few of those people could have left them off the ballots and maybe pushed for Tommy John or pushed for another candidate. So I think that's more the gamesmanship aspect of it. And the classic era, as we talked about, they just put out an amazing ballot. 1 through 8, those were legit Hall of Fame candidates. 8 guys that I would be happy to see in Cooperstown. Shoeless Joe Jackson, Pete Rose, also are those levels of candidates. So where do they fit in? And like you said, Pete Rose isn't going to get to see his day in the sun. The Baseball Hall of Fame has been trying to make an intentional effort to put players on the ballot and elect them while they're still alive. And now you have these 2 ghosts that you have to address and you have to give the platform. Now, does that mean that because of the new thing where if they don't do well, they don't return, you do an all dead player ballot with some early dead ball players or some, more throwaway candidates to try to boost these players up and not punish, a living candidate like a Tommy John or a Steve Garvey or whoever it may be? It'll be very interesting to see how they compose the classic era ballot in 2027. I don't think you can have Rose and Jackson together. I think they have to pick one and see how they do.
So there are multiple things I want to touch on there. While the Baseball Hall of Fame is a nonprofit, they are in the business of selling tickets and having people flock to Cooperstown. Absolutely. It is why there is a more intentional emphasis on wanting living candidates elected. Like the Hall wants that because, to see the guy, have his day in the sun and give his speech and to be there for your guy, to come to the little town in Cooperstown, New York, and spend a weekend in the village and see that happen. That's the picture they want to paint. Okay. But even among Jackson and Rose, who are both deceased, is Shoeless Joe Jackson going to draw? I would argue probably not. Is Pete Rose going to draw, even though he's deceased, if he's elected? 100%. There's no doubt that, you could say you were at the induction weekend when Pete Rose was inducted. I think Reds fans and baseball fans will flock to that village on Rose's behalf if that happens. But I don't think that's the case for Shoeless Joe Jackson. So being to your point of, structuring who's on that ballot and whatnot, they're very smart people. Okay. They are more likely to spread out maybe some of their slam dunk candidates that are living away from Rose. And I think, we were talking a little bit off air before we started this, and I think that there could even be public outcry if Shoeless Joe was on the first ballot of this type, that they were both eligible to be on the ballot and Rose wasn't. I think they almost have to do Rose first, and then if they want to spread them out, do Shoeless Joe next. Even though your statement was, well, Shoeless Joe's been waiting much longer than Rose, and you're not wrong.
So that's the thing. So for the court of public opinion, they can decide to do that. This decision clearly was made in the last 7 months since Pete Rose passed away, not the last 74 years since Shoeless Joe Jackson passed away.
Right.
So this is happening for Rose. He's the hit king, almost 80 career WAR, all-time leader in games played, plate appearances, at-bats, hits. He was a legend. But I personally, if I was the Hall of Fame, I'd almost want to put Shoeless Joe Jackson first because he's been waiting longer. And, if he gets in, which I believe he'd have a strong chance to do so, then Pete Rose becomes, a slam dunk of slam dunks. You can do it either way. I think it'll be fine. I just know you can't put them both together because they might cannibalize each other's votes in terms of the committee, depending on who's in there. As for the selling tickets, White Sox fans don't have a lot to be cheering about right now. I know people don't love to follow modern day baseball. The Pete Rose thing. I was at Pete Rose's induction, a day that no one ever thought was going to happen. Imagine the White Sox fans that were around, maybe met Shoeless Joe in the 40s or 50s. Never thought they'd see that day. So I'm not saying you're still not getting to see the guy get inducted. So there is some aspect of that. But I think that both of them would draw, eyeballs for that reason of these are days that weren't expected by many to happen. This is like a what if moment, like if there was a different reality where Rob Manfred was not the people's commissioner, maybe they never appeared on the ballot. It's a great thought experiment, and I'm interested to see. They have 2 years to mull it over, so 2.5 actually. So it'll be interesting to see how they, parse this, and I hope it doesn't get in the way of, like we said, some of these deserving living candidates getting to see their day in the sun because now, boom, Pete Rose is eligible. Boom, Shoeless Joe Jackson is eligible. Boom, some of these other guys get some support as well because there was 15 other names that got reinstated as well. So
what if there was one other alternative motive here? What if behind closed doors, the Hall, their hands kind of forced in a way to put them on the ballot? But what if they don't want them elected? So they intentionally put them on the same ballot to have them cannibalize each other's votes with other strong candidates. And then if they didn't get elected that first go round, they could throw up their hands and say, we put them on the ballot. They didn't get enough support. Now we're not putting them back on there. I mean, who's to say that they don't do that?
That's part of the reason why I'm in the camp of it might be Shoeless first. He's been waiting longer, but he's also less likely, I think, of the two to get that outswell of support and get elected if he's on a strong ballot. So if Shoeless Joe Jackson appears on one of these ballots and, does okay or doesn't do well, that would be, not great for Pete Rose. And I know Pete Rose is a more deserving Hall of Fame candidate, a bigger name. There's more players and GMs and managers that have interacted with him personally. But it'll be interesting to see how the Hall of Fame handles it, because you're right. This was Rob Manfred's, moment of glory. The Hall of Fame kind of has to adjust as I'm adjusting with my Hall of Fame opinion about this. So yeah, Pete Rose and Shoeless Joe Jackson should be Hall of Famers. How are these committees going to go about it? Because it's not like they're putting them on the baseball writers ballot this year. They're putting them in an era committee in a controlled, smaller environment where there's a lot of opinions and hardened hearts and different things that can happen. So it'll be very interesting to see how they do on the ballot. I do think this decision was mainly made for Rose. Like I said, 7 months after he died, he'll probably be the first one to get a crack at it. And, hopefully he does well, so Shoeless Joe can get his day in the sun as well. But it's just a real chess game they're playing, as is with the structure of the era committees.
Exactly.
That, adding two big, unforeseen asteroids like this crashing into Earth How are you going to defend everything?
Well, and the other component here, we had Frank Baseball Hall of Fame Autographs on our show here to talk about how this happens, how the era committees are put together, and how these guys are selected. I think it will impact Shoeless Joe less because we are so far removed from his contemporaries, from his playing days. But for Rose, there are plenty of guys that played the game against him, were his teammates, were managers, were general managers, so on and so forth during his playing days and during his life that could be chosen to be on this committee. And that could greatly impact what happens with him, regardless of Rob Manfred opening the door or the Hall of Fame opening the door. There are plenty of current Hall of Famers, both very outspoken on both sides of this coin, that have been pro-Rose and very anti-Rose getting in the Hall or even being considered. So the Hall also has influence there, while their public statement says, well, they're eligible to be put on the ballot. They could still rig the system to make something more likely or less likely based on who they put in that room.
We won't know until the committee is formed in December 2027. But in my humble opinion, speaking way far out, to be amended, when you throw something like the ineligibility list out the window, an unprecedented feat, we always say with these era committees, it matters about who's in the room. Like at the end of the day, no matter how good the candidates are, it matters who's in the room. I think for these two cases especially, Shoeless Joe and Pete Rose, you throw that out the window too, because just as the court of public opinion, the public pressure got Rob Manfred to get this ball rolling, this is going to be the first time ever that these two players get a chance to join baseball royalty in the Hall of Fame. And because of the new added level, that if they do not do well, they may not be considered for a long time or ever again. There's going to be immense pressure on the people in that room to say, can I really vote for someone with 2,000 less hits than Pete Rose, over Pete Rose on this committee? Can I really be the person that leaves the hit king out of the Hall of Fame? And I'm not saying they can't construct a wall of defense electorate that is like very anti-Rose and gambling and have spoken out against him, and they can do that. But there's going to be immense pressure on those 16 people in that room. This is in the words of Eminem, this is your one shot, your one opportunity. Don't miss your chance to blow. You're getting something that no one thought was ever going to happen. No one thought Pete Rose was ever going to be eligible for the Hall of Fame. At least the people that were, thinking logically with the way that rule was. And now you're sitting in front of a ballot, and Pete Rose's name has a box next to it.
One final thought on that is, obviously, if you haven't figured it out, if I had a vote, I would vote for Rose. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, everything that you just painted essentially means that the person that's in that room that has that opportunity to be a part of history, whose hero are you going to be, right? That's kind of the picture that you're painting. Are you going to be the one that holds him back? There is an alternative angle to that of, we don't know within the fraternity of Hall of Famers, for the guys that are in the Hall that are put on that committee, they could be the last line of defense for what maybe the guys in that fraternity feel. If behind closed doors that, the majority of Hall of Famers, let's say, are anti-Rose getting in, and they feel like they're the last line of defense, guys, like, we got to hold the line. This is it. That is a real possibility. I know most baseball fans are going to be excited about it. Most of our listeners are probably going to be excited about it. We're excited about the possibility of it. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't put them in. We don't get to vote. Now, the chances are non-zero because 2 days ago, they were. I guess they weren't non-zero. It did get reversed, but very close to zero. exponentially higher than they were. But this not only has ramifications on the Hall itself and this process and what's going to happen a couple years from now. And I know that we'll be talking about it again. But for immediate impact, in addition to our reaction, this is on a YouTube hobby channel. Dom, do you think that this impacts the hobby in any way now and or in the future for these guys that we're going to talk about? We're going to add on with Rose. We'll start with Rose and Shoeless Joe, and then we'll go a little bit deeper. But what are your thoughts?
At the time of recording, less than 24 hours from this news dropping, I had over half a dozen baseball and YouTube and sports card collecting group chats post the news, discuss the news. I also had many people that I know send this to me because they've known my stance on this and how I'm that person that's always in the comments section, reiterating that he is not eligible, that this isn't a real discussion. Now it is a real discussion. And even in Facebook sale groups, Twitter, I haven't looked at eBay yet. People are asking, I need Rose, Shoeless Joe Jackson cards. Like, everyone is feeling that FOMO. They know that they have this 2-year window leading up to the election. The window we talk about with the Hall of Fame. If you want, autographs and cards affordable of Pete Rose, I wouldn't buy them right now. I think there's a big push, but there's going to be a window between now and December 2027.
Yeah,
where you look back after he gets elected and you're like, oh, that was a good time to buy Pete Rose. His cards are way more now. And that's insane to me because his 1963 Topps floating head card, which you own, is a card that I think could never have been more overpriced. He's the all-time hit king, but he was ineligible for the Hall of Fame and, was famous for a bad reason, infamy. That card is extremely expensive as is. That card gets added to the PSA post-war Hall of Fame rookie card registry, as we just talked about with Lou Rock on the latest episode of the show. People are going to flock. There's a lot of people that collect, the Hall of Fame. It's a huge focus of my collection. It's a huge focus of yours.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have Pete Rose or Shoeless Joe Jackson representing your Hall of Fame collection, clock is now ticking. It is officially ticking. So there's clearly been a huge influx in demand. Like everything else in the news cycle, some months will go on. Things will die down. There will be a window to buy them before they get the HOF next to their eBay listings and everything, auctions and stuff. But it clearly will have a huge hobby impact. It already is. And I think that umbrella effect will only, continue to heat up until one of them officially gets elected by the Hall of Fame.
So for Rose, I got a couple Rose autographs on card, and I've got a Rose autograph baseball. I think the slight uptick we saw, especially for probably the most popular Rose autograph, is the I'm Sorry I Bet on Baseball, autographed baseball. And those did see a slight uptick after he passed, kind of settled. They're a little bit higher than what they were, to when he was living, because there won't be any more, obviously. But I think in terms of autographs, Rose's autograph kind of is where it'll be. He's always been kind of treated as a Hall of Famer. Now, if he was scarcer, I think it would move the needle if he then was inducted. But because he did sign so much, I don't think, other than the temporary spike, if he were to get in, I don't think it'll really move the needle on most Rose autographs. Could it on vintage signed, like playing days Rose? Could that affect it? Probably. I would believe that those would go up a little bit. But I think for him specifically, hobby-wise, there are two cards that it will really matter for. It's his second year, 1964. The Rookie Cup card that's very popular among the people in the hobby, especially those that aren't a fan of the floating head and the cost associated with his rookie card already. It's already a fairly valuable card compared to the rest of his cards, 65 and so on throughout his career. I do believe that it will see an uptick if this happens. And as hard as it kind of is to believe, I think so will his rookie card, even though it is already outrageous and he is already treated like a Hall of Famer, especially in terms of that card. I think it will go up some. In a somewhat justifiable, vilified kind of way. Now, Shoeless Joe Jackson, on the other hand, he has very, very, very few playing days cards. You've got some strip cards, you've got some candy cards, you've got the Cracker Jack, cards that are mostly out of the average hobbyist range to just go out and purchase a Shoeless Joe. They've seen some growing popularity already prior to this announcement in recent years. If he were to get in, I think it would give him another reason to be in the spotlight. I do think those cards would see an additional spike that may not be completely sustainable, but probably reach a new plateau post-spike as opposed to the prior one. The one card that I think could go even higher than it already is, and it's not really rational, but it's quote unquote, in my mind, the affordable Shoeless Joe, is the 1940 play ball. Now, I saw the reverse take of this, that they thought that someone in our community thought this card would go down if Shoeless Joe got inducted because it's not a playing days card. I would argue the opposite, because it's like the only affordable Shoeless Joe Jackson card there is. Not to mention, it has the nickname on the front of the card. I mean, that is super cool and collectible in itself. And I think it'll be the only one within reach for your average collector that would save up to possibly get a Shoeless Joe. It's a vintage Shoeless Joe, just not a playing days Shoeless Joe. What are your thoughts on Shoeless Joe's hobby before we move on to a couple other guys that we want to briefly touch on from a hobby perspective?
It was already way too expensive for me personally. But I agree with you. I think the Hall of Fame bump is real, especially when it's for people that were unexpected. When you look at like the surprise Hall of Fame elections, I'm not saying they get to ridiculous heights, but the percentage jump is usually pretty substantial. These are two guys that were collected like this, partially because they were blackballed from baseball and kept out of the Hall of Fame. Will that impact their legacy, 50 years post-election, where they don't have that gravitas anymore of, being banned and blackballed and vilified? Like tragic stories. People love tragedy. They can't look away from the car accident. Like that is to be determined. But in the present day, the high-end Pete Rose and the high-end Shoeless Joe Jackson, if you think it's too expensive now, which I did, today's prices will be tomorrow's bargain once they have HOF. It will go up a substantial, significant percentage, especially because 10% at that level is a good amount of money, as opposed to a 10% jump on a Dave Parker card post-election. So Shoeless Joe Jackson's hobby was already strong. I think the fact that he is in some of the iconic pre-war sets and had, some very desirable cards already, that will even more so entice people to, collect him and go after those cards, especially the high rollers. I don't have a Shoeless Joe in my collection yet. I should have one. He's in the Hall of Fame now. Like, they finally recognized him. And like I said, he is the fourth all-time in batting average, which is not, a slept-on feat. It is actually really impressive. And what's crazy about it is Shoeless Joe Jackson never won a batting title. despite his 356 career average. And in his career, he batted 387, 408, 395, 373. That was a 4-year stretch in a row. Didn't win the batting title. He batted over 400.
Pretty crazy.
So,
and, people like to talk about Shoeless Joe and what he could have been, if he would have been able to finish his career. And I know you're more of a WAR guy than I am, but, he's above 60 WAR for what he was able to accrue over the lifetime of his career. And also, if you look at like his 162, like you already mentioned, his batting average. But in addition to that, like his on-base percentage was 423 for his career. His per 162 was 216 hits a year on average, 106 runs, 96 RBIs, and would steal, 25 stolen bases. I mean, Shoeless Joe was a quality player for the time that he did play. His notoriety far outreaches the milestones that he was able to achieve for his short career. But the quality of his play, the qualitative component is dang near undeniable. So he is, I don't know if I would call him a slam dunk candidate, but he's an upper tier qualitative candidate. Like, I'd be shocked if he didn't get elected, unless it goes the way that we've been talking about. That is a possibility.
Yeah, and you're talking about the modern day sabermetrics too, the on base. He slugged too for the era. I know he only has 54 career home runs, but he was consistently a 35 to 40 double guy, and also had 2 seasons of which he hit over 20 triples. So he was, 3 seasons where he had 20 plus triples, including his final season at the age of 32. So he was really, really special for his time. He has that 300, 400, 500 slash line that got Todd Helton into the Hall of Fame very recently. And his career OPS plus of 170 was 70% better than the league average hitter of his time. I know it was the dead ball era, but that does mean something. To me, he's a slam dunk. And if he played until he was in his late 30s, like a lot of the other legends of that time, the Nap Lajoies and the Trish Speakers and the Ty Cobbs, you'd be talking about someone that, was in one of the first 3 or 4 Hall of Fame classes. Without the suspension. So I think his hobby and Pete Rose's hobby is already established, and it will just get that Hall of Fame bump. But there are a couple other players from the other 15 names that are interesting flyers to consider as Hall of Fame candidates now being eligible. I know you wanted to talk about them, Jake, being T206 subjects.
Yes, and 2 of them I think are more realistic than the third, but the third one is a fun and interesting mention. If you've stuck around with us this long, I think you'll enjoy it. The first name that is a part of that Black Sox scandal that will be mentioned in some baseball circles as a potential candidate is Eddie Cicotte. Okay, if you're unfamiliar with Eddie Cicotte, he was the ringleader of the Black Sox scandal. It's very well documented. He was also banned along with Shoeless Joe and the others in 1921, despite being acquitted in the public trial. If you didn't know that, they're actually acquitted in the public trial, and then Kennesaw Mountain Landis banned them anyways, calling them a black mark on the game. Now, Eddie Cicotte, he had 59 WAR in his career. At the time of when he was banned from baseball, he was 36 years old in 1920. He had played 14 seasons. He did have over 200 wins at the time, 209, and his average over 162 was 16 wins a season. Now, in that 1919 season, he had 29 wins, and in 1920, he had 21 wins. So there's a decent chance he might have had some more left in the tank. maybe another 20 games season or two in the tank left there. If he pitched to age 40 or beyond, which wasn't uncommon in that era, there's a decent chance that he could have eclipsed 250 wins. We'll never know. He did also win an ERA title, and his career ERA was 2.38, had 1,374 strikeouts. And he actually won a World Series in 1917 with the White Sox prior to the scandal, and had a whip for his career of 1.15. Now, in terms of hobby for Eddie Cicotte, he is already treated within the T206 set like he is a mid-level Hall of Famer, I would say, T206 subject. You can get his card in a 1-ish, 2-ish grade in that kind of like $200 to $300 range, which by comparison, some of the lower end Hall of Famers like a Bresnahan or an Ironman McGinnity, they bring low 100s for a card in the similar condition. So he's, before this news, was already treated slightly above that. Now, if he was to gain ground, if he somehow was elected to the Hall of Fame, which I wouldn't vote for him for the record, but if he did gain election, it does tend to move the needle, in my opinion, more for a vintage or especially a pre-war player that is elected to the Hall of Fame to see that bump, whether it is near when they're eligible or long removed, in this case, that they're newly eligible and then was to gain entry. Example, Gil Hodges was in the vintage era, and his cards held value. He's part of the Brooklyn Dodgers and all of their aura and mystique, and was a really good player. But once he was elected, his rookie card jumped big time, multiplier on that thing. I think that would also be the case if a Cicotte were to get in. Do you have any additional thoughts on Cicotte before I move to the next player, Dom?
Yeah, I mean, 59 WAR, 200 wins, that 2.38 ERA you were talking about, you kind of glossed over it. That's the 24th best earned run average of all time.
He was really good.
Very, very good. Talk about a White Sox pitcher that's worthy of being a Hall of Fame candidate. This is another pitcher that is above the Mark Burley line, and I'm for Eddie Cicotte as a Hall of Fame candidate. I think he's more deserving than Mark Burley, and Mark Burley has hung around on the ballot. So, the right committee could vote Cicotte in. I think Cicotte being labeled as you said, the ringleader in the movie 8 Men Out. The owner did not want to give him his bonus because he didn't win 30 games, and he got sat his last 2 starts of the season when he had 29 wins. And that's why he threw it to get the money that he was supposed to get for his bonus. That's Hollywood, but I think him being the ringleader, he's very unlikely to get support if he even lands on one of these ballots. But I think when you're just talking, career, he's the clear number 3 after Rose and Jackson from the 17 players that have been reinstated.
I would agree. Man, Cicotte, Burley 2027, that's my kind of ballot. That's my kind of running mates right there. Let's go. I'd vote for Cicotte in that scenario. White Sox.
If he's pot committed to getting Mark Burley elected, you would vote for Cicotte? Is that what you're saying?
I'm in.
I think they're 2 separate guys.
I know. So far removed. All right, the next guy. Also a T206 subject, actually the player on the most different T206 cards in terms of images, front images in the whole set. Do you know who it is?
Hal Chase.
Hal Chase. That is right. And he was known, widely regarded as, quote unquote, the best defensive first baseman of his era by his contemporaries. He was banned from baseball. Sort of. This is where it gets a little interesting. Depending on what you read and what you believe, Hal Chase threw games, was slapped on the wrist with suspension, was reinstated, was accused of throwing more games, and essentially was blackballed by, I think it was the National League first, and then the American League kind of followed suit. and he never found his way back into Major League Baseball. At the time, to my understanding, there was not an official ban of Hal Chase from baseball. However, when Kennesaw Mountain Landis made the statement barring the Black Sox from Major League Baseball, the specific statement that he made was anyone that was known to have gambled on the game would never be welcome in the game again, which unofficially made Hal Chase's ban official. Okay, that was in 1921. Hal Chase then passed away, for what it's worth, in 1947 at the age of 64. So he has actually been deceased longer than Shoeless Joe Jackson being on the ineligible list and having a somewhat relevant Hall of Fame case. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Hal Chase, he did play for 15 years. He did have over 2,000 hits, 2,158. He did steal 363 bases. He had a career batting average of 291 with an on base of 319. He also did win a batting title during his career. Now, he may not be the most decorated, as there were not all-star games, there were not gold gloves, there were not silver sluggers, obviously, in the pre-war era. But Hal Chase has always been treated already sort of as a minor Hall of Famer in terms of price in the T206 set. He's somewhere between above a star but below Hall of Famer is the way he's been treated. If for some reason he was elected, I do believe that he would probably jump into that 200-ish value range, where now he can be had anywhere from 80 to 125 in low condition for most of the poses he is in the T206 set. One other thing I've mentioned before I flip it to you, Dom, on Hal Chase is he has the portraits. He has some different poses, a dark cap, a light cap, the pink background portrait. But probably the coolest Hal Chase card to me is he's the only player in the T206 set that is holding a trophy on one of his cards. And there's a fun rabbit hole you can go down to find out what that trophy was for and why it was depicted as it, because it wasn't an MVP. So if you want to go down that rabbit hole, go check that out. But Hal Chase is an interesting name that comes to light because of this newly eligible list.
I love that you gave the hardcore listeners that have listened this long some homework for the ones that are really into the nitty gritty. This is where I start to lose Hall of Fame vibes. We're talking about a guy who has 23 career WAR. Yes, he has over 2,000 hits. Yes, he has over 300 stolen bases. But he just misses RBIs and run qualifiers for me. He's not a real candidate. But hey, all those different poses in the T206 set, that's affordable guy who could get his name called on the era committee someday. I think with the way the era committees are currently structured, that the borderline dead ball guys, the white players, they don't have too much of a shot with the way things are currently structured. And there's some guys that we've talked about, Jim McCormick and Bad Bill Dahl and different things like that, that are light years ahead as candidates from the same era than a Hal Chase. So I don't see it, but a noteworthy name from the 17 guys at least.
I agree. He's the next biggest name from these guys. Worth mentioning, Prince Hal's an interesting character. There is a book written about him that I really want to get. It has been mentioned by another YouTuber, and it's eluding me right now who that is, but I really want to get that book and read up on Hal Chase. But this last guy that we want to talk about here is kind of the fun fact, the fun nugget here at the end, and a shout out to a friend of the podcast here, Dan of Dan's Vintage Baseball PC. If you're listening, this is for you, buddy. Okay, we're going to talk about Benny Koff. If you've never heard of Benny Koff, he was known amicably as the Federal League Ty Cobb. He won back-to-back batting titles while he was in the fledgling Federal League that only lasted a few years. If you don't know about the Federal League, another interesting thing to research and look up. He is in the Cracker Jack set, an iconic set. I know Dan owns this card, and it is listed there, along with his team, that it lists the league as well in those cards, and it says Federal League. Those are just so cool. I know for me, I'd love to have a common someday that just says Federal League on it from the Cracker Jack set. I think that would be really cool. And while Benikoff realistically doesn't have a shot at the Hall of Fame, I'm just going to be honest. He played 8 years. He only had 961 hits. He did have those 2 batting titles, 311 career average, over 200 stolen bases, and just under a 400 career OBP at 389. And his per 162, no slouch, 181 hits, 98 runs, 86 RBIs, along with 44 stolen bases on average. He just didn't have the longevity because of the scandal that he was involved in and how he wound up on the ineligible list to begin with. But a fun name, an interesting story, and a cool guy to collect for at least one guy in the YouTube community. Did I do Benikoff justice, Dom?
To his credit, for the era he played in, his combination of power and speed was impressive. It was in the Federal League. It was very short. I don't think they're going to waive the 10-year rule for Benikoff, even though in basically 7 seasons, he had more WAR than the aforementioned Hal Chase, with 29 WAR on Baseball Reference. 311 career hitter. Love that. 2 batting titles. His age 24 season is video game numbers. 7 WAR season in the Federal League. But you were pandering to one guy. You were pandering to Dan. We know is going to listen to this. Dan, we love you here at Cracking Cooperstown. Jake is pandering to become the 6th collector currently. This is why the Benikoff segment made the final show sheet here on the emergency episode. But no, a fun name nonetheless. And like you said, he's in some of those iconic sets. It's a way to collect a common, but a player that actually had a very good career, which is kind of the fun in prospecting, potential future Hall of Famers, is you're collecting players that, contributed and gave something great to the game, at least for a period of time. And that's what's fun about collecting. If you can't afford the Pete Roses or the Shoeless Joe Jacksons of the world, and you want to kind of get into this reinstatement craze, we just gave you 3 names to check out. So we know the fellow Hall of Fame nuts like us that stick around to the end would be interested in doing that. Now, most of these guys were banned by Kennesaw Mountain Landis in 1921, so autographs are really tough to come by or expensive no matter who it is. So we won't talk about that here. We hope that we covered the whole range of things. We want to hear from each and every one of you. I know there's been some people when Pete Rose wasn't even brought up that would comment about Pete Rose. This is the video to do so. I am here for the discourse. I am here to talk. I am open to this possibility as Robert Manfred Jr. has opened the floodgates to this conversation. And we have until December 2027 to talk about through all the hypotheticals. So I'm here for it. You can comment below or DM me over on Instagram at Staven Sports Cards. As for my host, Jake Brewer, you can find him everywhere at Legends Never Die Collection. Jake, let's round the people out here on their Wednesday morning.
Hope you guys enjoyed our emergency episode of Cracking Cooperstown. I know I've enjoyed doing it with Dom on short notice. But until the next time you tune in to listen with us, keep collecting and God bless.